She laughed first. That was what nobody forgot. Emily Carter did not whisper it or mutter it under her breath. She laughed out loud right there behind the counter of Walker Financial, loud enough for every person in the lobby to hear when the man in the faded jacket stepped up to her window. "Sir, are you sure you have the right place?" she said, still smiling. "This is a bank, not a shelter." The lobby went quiet for exactly 1 second. Then a few people smiled. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody said a word. And the man in the old jacket said nothing either. He simply looked at her and left. What none of them knew was that he would be back the next morning. And when he returned, every manager in that building would go completely silent. Jacob Walker did not own a single suit he wore regularly. That was not because he could not afford one. He owned several pressed and hanging in a closet he rarely opened, kept there for board meetings and legal signings, and the occasional event where his absence would raise more questions than his presence. But on most days, Jacob moved through the city the way he had always preferred, quietly, without announcement, in whatever was clean and comfortable and unlikely to draw attention. That morning, he had pulled on a dark olive jacket that had seen better days, a plain gray shirt, and a pair of worn jeans. He had done it without thinking. He had been doing it for years. The Walker Financial branch on Caldwell Avenue was not the largest in the city, but it handled a significant volume of daily transactions and had been flagged twice in internal reviews for customer wait times that ran longer than company standards allowed. Jacob had noted that in a report 3 months earlier. He had not visited in person since the branch opened under its current management roughly 2 years prior. He had a personal account there, listed under a name that the branch staff would recognize only if they bothered to look carefully, which most people in his experience never did. The transaction he needed to complete that morning was straightforward, a fund transfer tied to a private account that required his physical signature and a specific form of identification. It was the kind of thing his assistant usually handled, but Jacob had cleared his morning and decided to go himself. No particular reason. He simply felt like it. He arrived at 8:47, 13 minutes before the branch reached its mid-morning peak. The lobby was already half full. A security guard near the entrance gave him a brief glance and looked away. Jacob took a number from the dispenser near the door, found a seat along the far wall, and waited. He watched the room the way he always did in any space he entered for the first time in a while, without urgency, without any particular expression. He watched how the staff moved behind the counters. He watched how they greeted the people in front of them. He watched a man in a business suit get waved forward by a young woman at the far window before his number was even called, while an older woman in a plain coat sat 3 seats down from Jacob and clutched her ticket with both hands, looking at the board, waiting her turn like everyone else. Jacob said nothing. He watched. When his number appeared on the overhead display, he walked to the open window at the center of the counter. The woman standing behind it was young, early 20s, with her hair pulled back neatly and a name tag that read, Emily. She was finishing a note on her keyboard when he stepped up, and when she looked up and saw him, something shifted in her face. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of shift that most people would miss entirely. A slight adjustment, a quick read, a conclusion drawn in under 2 seconds. Jacob had seen that look before on other faces in other rooms. He knew exactly what it meant. "Can I help you?" Emily asked. Her tone was not rude yet. It was something just short of rude, clipped flat, carrying the particular flavor of someone who had already decided that this interaction was going to be a waste of her time. Jacob told her he needed to complete a fund transfer and that he had the required documentation. He placed a folded envelope on the counter. Emily did not reach for it immediately. She looked at it, then looked at him, then looked at the line behind him, as if calculating whether she could redirect this somewhere else. "Do you have an account with us?" she asked. Jacob said he did, and gave her the account reference number. Emily typed it in slowly. Whatever came up on her screen, she did not react to it visibly, but her jaw tightened slightly. "This account requires additional verification," she said. "You'd need to make an appointment." Jacob told her he understood that, and explained that he had called ahead the previous week to confirm that the documentation he brought would be sufficient for a same-day transaction. He kept his voice even. Emily glanced at the envelope again, then back at him. "I don't see any appointment on file," she said. "And I can't process this at the window without an appointment confirmation. You'd have to come back." She said it the way someone says something they have said many times before, and have stopped feeling anything about not cruel, not kind, just finished. Jacob asked if a supervisor was available to review the account and confirm that the documentation was in order. It was a reasonable request. Emily's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did. "Sir," she said, and she said the word in a way that was not respectful. "I think there might be a misunderstanding about what kind of accounts we handle here." She glanced at his jacket, just once, quickly. "If you're looking for assistance with a basic savings account or a loan application, I can point you to the right department. But if you're telling me you have a private transfer account with this branch, I'm going to need a lot more than a reference number," and she gestured vaguely at the envelope. "Whatever that is." The lobby was not silent. There was still the low noise of conversation, the sound of keyboards, the soft chime of the number display changing. But the 2 or 3 people standing nearest to Jacob's window had slowed. One man waiting at the adjacent window had turned his head slightly. A woman further back in the line had looked up from her phone. Emily took a small breath, and then, as if deciding the moment called for something more direct, she raised her voice just enough to carry. "Are you sure you have the right place?" she said, and she was smiling now, the kind of smile that was not a smile at all. "This is a bank, not a shelter." A few people laughed, not loudly, not all of them, but enough. Jacob did not move. He stood at the counter and looked at Emily Carter and said nothing for a long moment. He did not look embarrassed. He did not look angry. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand carefully, without emotion storing the information. Then Richard Coleman appeared. Richard was the branch manager. He was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered with the kind of practiced authority that came from years of being the most senior person in a room that was not very large. He walked out from the back office with his jacket buttoned and his face already arranged into the expression he used for handling disruptions. Not hostile, but firm, the look of a man who had made up his mind before he arrived. "Is there a problem here?" Richard asked, positioning himself beside Emily and slightly in front of her, which told Jacob everything about where this was going. Jacob explained again calmly that he was trying to complete a documented transaction on a private account, and that the employee had declined to process it without an appointment that had in fact been arranged. He spoke clearly, and without raising his voice. He did not mention the comment about the shelter. Richard listened with the particular kind of listening that is not listening at all, the kind where a person is simply waiting for a gap in which to insert what they have already decided to say. "Sir," Richard said, "our staff follows specific protocols for every type of account and transaction. If Emily has indicated that an appointment is required, then an appointment is required. I trust my team to handle customer interactions appropriately." He said appropriately, with a slight emphasis that was not subtle. "If you'd like to schedule something for later in the week, I'm sure we can find a time that works." Jacob looked at Richard the same way he had looked at Emily, steady, unhurried. "I'd like to speak with someone above your level," Jacob said. Richard's expression did not change, but his chin lifted slightly. "That won't be necessary. I'm the branch manager, and I'm fully equipped to—" "I understand," Jacob said. "I'd still like to speak with someone above your level." There was a beat of silence. Richard looked at Emily. Emily looked at the counter. "That's not something I can arrange on short notice," Richard said. "If you have a formal complaint, you're welcome to submit it through our online portal." He reached beneath the counter and produced a small card with the bank's website printed on it. He placed it on the counter with the practiced efficiency of someone who had ended many conversations this way. "Marcus," he said without turning around. The security guard, a tall man named Marcus, who had been standing near the entrance, walked over with the quiet inevitability of someone following a script they had followed many times before. He did not grab Jacob. He simply appeared at Jacob's left side and said in a low and not unkind voice, "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside." Jacob looked at the card on the counter. He picked up his envelope. He did not say anything else. He walked toward the exit with Marcus at his side, and the lobby watched him go. Some people openly, most pretending not to. And when the glass door swung shut behind him, and the cool air of the street replaced the climate-controlled warmth of the lobby, Jacob Walker stood on the sidewalk for a moment and simply breathed. He was not shaking. He was not humiliated, at least not in the way Emily had intended. What he felt standing there on the sidewalk outside his own bank was something quieter and more unsettling than anger. He felt recognition, the kind that comes not when something surprises you, but when something confirms what you had already begun to suspect. He had built Walker Holdings over 15 years. He had started with a single investment fund and expanded into financial services, private banking, and regional lending. The core principle that had guided every acquisition and every internal policy, the one he had written himself, the one that appeared in the employee handbook, the one that was printed on a framed panel inside every branch, entrance was a single sentence. Every client who walks through our door deserves to be treated as our most important client. He had meant it when he wrote it. He had assumed it was being followed. Standing on the sidewalk on Caldwell Avenue in a faded jacket, Jacob understood that somewhere between the writing of that sentence and this morning, something had gone very wrong. And it had not gone wrong because of one employee making one bad joke. That was not how these things happened. They happened slowly through permission, through a culture that allowed people like Emily to laugh at a man in old clothing and people like Richard to stand beside her and call it protocol. They happened because somewhere in the chain, the wrong behavior had been left uncorrected long enough to become normal. Jacob did not call his assistant. He did not call legal. He stood on the sidewalk for a while longer, and he thought about the older woman in the plain coat who had been sitting 3 seats down from him, gripping her number with both hands, waiting patiently for her turn. He thought about how many people like her came through that door every week and received exactly the kind of treatment he had just received without the ability to do anything about it. Without a name anyone in that building would have to reckon with. He thought about the 2 options in front of him. He could escalate this through the proper channels file, a complaint flag the branch, and the next internal review let the process run. That was the clean administrative answer. The branch would receive a memo. Richard would receive a warning. Emily would be spoken to. And in 6 months, when the next internal review came around, everything would look exactly the same on paper as it always had. Or he could go back, himself, the same jacket, the same envelope, and actually look at what was happening inside that building. Jacob put the card in his pocket, the one with the website printed on it. He did not throw it away. He folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his faded jacket and walked back to his car. He sat there for a few minutes before he started the engine. He thought about what he had seen, not just what had been done to him, but the man in the suit who had been waved forward before his number was called, and the woman at the counter who had not gotten up from her seat even to acknowledge it, and the small laugh that had moved through the lobby like something no one was responsible for. He thought about all of it, and he made his decision. He would go back tomorrow morning. Same time. Same clothes. And this time, he would not come alone, not in the way they would expect. He sent a single text message before he pulled out of the parking space. It went to one person, his chief legal counsel, a sharp and methodical man named Gerald Tate, who had been with Walker Holdings for 11 years and who understood without needing it, explained at length what Jacob was asking when he wrote simply, "I need you at the Caldwell branch tomorrow morning at 9. Don't come in until I text you. And don't tell anyone why you're there. Also, contact Sandra Lyle and have her meet you there. Don't explain why to her either. Just tell her it concerns the branch and that she needs to be present. Gerald's response came back in under 2 minutes. Understood. Jacob drove home through the late morning traffic and said nothing to anyone. He ate lunch alone. He read through the last internal audit report for the Caldwell branch that evening, the one he had skimmed 3 months ago and filed away. He read it more carefully this time. He noticed the things he had glossed over before, the customer satisfaction scores, that were low but not low enough to trigger a formal review. The complaint volume that had been logged as moderate, the note at the bottom of page 7 that said 3 customer escalation requests in the prior quarter had been resolved at the branch level without further documentation. He put the report down and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then he went to sleep. He set his alarm for 7:30. He did not change out of the clothes he planned to wear the next morning. He already knew what he would put on: the same olive jacket, the same gray shirt, the same worn jeans. Because whoever Jacob Walker was in every other room in his life tomorrow morning, he was going to walk back through that door as exactly what Emily Carter had decided he was when she looked at him and laughed. And he was going to find out how deep this went. He walked through the same glass door at 8:51 the following morning. Same jacket, same gray shirt, same worn jeans. He had not done anything to make himself look different, and he had not done anything to make himself look worse. He simply arrived as himself, which was the only version of himself that mattered for what he needed to see today. The lobby was slightly fuller than it had been the morning before. The same overhead display cycled through numbers. The same soft chime sounded every time a window opened. Jacob took a number from the dispenser near the entrance, found a seat along the wall, and settled in to wait. Marcus, the security guard from the previous morning, was at his post near the door. He glanced at Jacob when he walked in, and something in his expression shifted, not hostility, but recognition, the particular alertness of someone who remembered a situation they had been asked to manage, and was now watching it walk back in through the door. Jacob did not look at Marcus. He looked at the room. He watched for 20 minutes before his number came up. In that time, he counted 3 separate interactions at the windows that told him more than any internal audit report had. A man in paint-stained work clothes was asked twice for identification, that a customer at the adjacent window, wearing a pressed shirt and carrying a leather briefcase, was never asked for at all. An older woman who spoke slowly and needed extra time to find her documents was visibly rushed by the teller assisting her, who kept glancing at the line behind her, as if the woman's pace was a personal inconvenience. A younger man in an expensive watch was greeted by name before he had even reached the counter, which meant someone had recognized him from across the lobby and had time to prepare a welcome. Jacob noted all of it. He did not write anything down. He did not need to. When his number appeared, he walked to the same center window as the morning before. Emily was there again. When she looked up and saw him, her expression moved through several things very quickly. Surprise, irritation, and then something that landed closer to amusement than anything else, as if his return confirmed something she had already thought about him. "You're back," Emily said. It was not a question. Jacob told her he was, and that he still needed to complete the same transaction as the previous morning, and that he had the same documentation with him. Emily leaned back slightly in her chair, not enough to be obviously dismissive, but enough. "Sir, I explained yesterday that this type of transaction requires a scheduled appointment," she said, her voice carrying the particular patience of someone who considered themselves to be dealing with a person who was not quite capable of understanding simple information. "That hasn't changed overnight. If you didn't call to schedule, I can't help you at this window." Jacob told her that he had called the previous week, that the appointment had been confirmed verbally by a member of the branch staff, and that he would like to have that confirmation reviewed. He kept his voice flat and even. Emily looked at her screen. "I don't see any appointment under the name you gave me yesterday," she said. "And without that on file, there's nothing I can do." She glanced past him at the line forming behind him. "There are other people waiting." Jacob asked for the second time in 2 days to speak with a supervisor. Emily's jaw tightened. She picked up her desk phone and said something into it quietly. And a minute later, a young man named Derek came out from a side office junior to Richard Coleman, clearly uncomfortable, clearly aware of what had happened the previous morning, and uncertain about his role in whatever was happening now. Derek told Jacob that he understood there had been some confusion, and that he was happy to help schedule an appointment for a later date. He said this with the careful tone of someone who had been briefed on the situation and instructed to de-escalate without conceding anything. Jacob told Derek that he did not need help scheduling an appointment. He told Derek that he needed to speak with someone above the branch manager level and that he was asking for the third time. Derek looked at Emily. Emily looked at her screen. Derek said that he was afraid the regional director was not available on short notice, and that the best he could do was log the request and pass it along. By this point, several people in the nearby area of the lobby had noticed the conversation. A woman 2 seats back in the waiting area had lowered her phone. A man at the adjacent window had stopped filling out his form. The ambient noise of the lobby had not dropped, but something in the texture of the room had shifted, that particular shift that happens when people sense a confrontation developing and begin to pay attention without wanting to appear to be paying attention. Emily, perhaps reading the room and perhaps not caring, made a decision. She looked at Jacob with an expression that was no longer even bothering to perform patience. "A look," she said, loudly enough that the shift in the room became complete. "I don't know what you're trying to accomplish here, but whatever it is, this is not the place for it. If you don't have an appointment and you don't have a legitimate reason to be at this window, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. We've been more than accommodating." The word accommodating landed in the room with a particular weight. Jacob heard it. The woman 2 seats back heard it. The man at the adjacent window heard it. Jacob looked at Emily for a moment without responding, and then he turned his head slightly and looked at the room. Not dramatically, not performing anything, just looking. And what he saw was the same thing he had seen the morning before. People watching, and not one of them saying anything. Richard Coleman came out of his office before Jacob could respond. He was buttoned up again, same expression as the day before, the look of a man arriving to close something down. "Mr. Richard began. "Walker," Jacob said. He said it quietly. Richard stopped. Something crossed his face, fast and private, and then it was gone, replaced by the controlled expression he wore like a uniform. "Mr. Walker," he said, and the name sounded strange in his mouth, like a word he was not yet sure how to pronounce. "I think we've reached the point where I'm going to need to ask you to leave, and if you are unable to do that, I'll have no choice but to contact the authorities." He said it with the confidence of a man who had made that call before and found that it worked. He reached for his phone. Jacob reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He did not take out the envelope. He took out his personal phone, unlocked it, and sent a single text message. The message went to Gerald Tate, who had been sitting in a parked car on the opposite side of Caldwell Avenue for the past 45 minutes, drinking coffee and reading documents on his tablet. The message contained 2 words, "I'm in." Richard was still holding his phone when the glass door opened. Gerald Tate entered first. He was 61, lean with silver hair, and the unhurried walk of a man who had spent 4 decades in rooms where things were decided. He was wearing a charcoal suit and carrying a leather document case that he had owned for 20 years. Behind him came Sandra Lyle, the regional director for the Eastern District of Walker Financial, who had received a call from Gerald the previous evening, instructing her to be at the Caldwell branch by 9 the following morning, and to come prepared for a serious operational discussion. She had not been told more than that, but she had worked with Gerald long enough to understand that when he used the word serious, he meant it. Behind Sandra came 2 members of the Walker Holdings legal team, both of them carrying folders, both of them in suits that cost more than a month of Richard Coleman's salary. The lobby noticed them immediately. That kind of entrance does not go unnoticed. The collective attention of the room pulled toward the door, the way attention always does when something shifts the weight of a space. Gerald walked directly to where Jacob was standing. He stopped beside him, looked at Richard Coleman, and said in a voice that carried clearly across the lobby without being raised, "Good morning. I'm Gerald Tate, Chief Legal Counsel for Walker Holdings. I believe you've been speaking with Mr. Jacob Walker, the majority shareholder and chief executive of this organization." Gerald did not gesture theatrically. He simply stood where he stood and let the information do what it was going to do. "We'll need a conference room." The silence that followed was the kind that does not happen by accident. It happens when an entire room recalibrates at the same moment. Emily's face went white. It was not a metaphor. The color left her face the way it leaves a person when the ground shifts beneath them, and they realize the thing they were standing on was not what they thought it was. She looked at Jacob, at the faded jacket, at the worn jeans, at the plain gray shirt, and then she looked at Gerald Tate, and then she looked back at Jacob, and the thing she had been in the last 2 days collapsed in on itself in the space of about 3 seconds. Richard Coleman did not go white. Richard Coleman went very still. He lowered his phone slowly. He looked at Sandra Lyle, who was the regional director he reported to, and Sandra Lyle wasn't looking at him. Sandra was looking at Jacob with an expression that contained both professionalism and the controlled, careful awareness of a person doing rapid damage assessment. "Mr. Walker," Sandra said, stepping forward and extending her hand. "I want you to know that I came as soon as Gerald reached me last evening. I was not aware of the full situation until then, and I am fully available to support whatever you need today." "Conference room," Jacob said. It was not rude. It was simply the end of the lobby portion of this. They moved to the back. The lobby watched them go. Every person in that building, tellers, customers. The man with the leather briefcase, the woman who had been gripping her number ticket, watched Jacob Walker walk past the counter and through the door to the back offices of his own bank, with his legal team behind him and his regional director beside him, wearing the same jacket he had been wearing when Marcus, the security guard, had walked him out of the building the morning before. Inside the conference room with the door closed, the conversation was direct and controlled. Jacob sat at the head of the table, which he did not do for effect, but simply because it was the nearest chair, and he said what he needed to say without raising his voice once. He told Gerald and Sandra that he had come to this branch on a legitimate personal transaction and had been publicly mocked, denied service without cause, and physically escorted from the premises by security. He told them that he had returned the following morning and witnessed the same pattern of behavior applied to multiple customers before his number had even been called. He told them he wanted the full security footage from both mornings, pulled and reviewed, and he wanted the complete customer complaint log for the previous 24 months made available to the legal team before the end of the business day. Sandra said she would authorize both immediately. Gerald was already writing. Jacob then said the thing that made Sandra stop moving and look at him directly. He told her that he did not believe this was about Emily Carter or Richard Coleman specifically. He told her that what he had watched over the course of 2 mornings was not a pair of bad employees behaving badly. It was a room full of people who had normalized it. It was a system that had decided at some point that was no longer traceable to a single decision, that the way a person was dressed told you something definitive about whether they deserved your time. He said that the 2 individuals who had spoken to him were the visible part of something that was much larger, and that if they went into this looking only for the people to fire, they were going to miss what actually needed to change. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she said she understood and asked how he wanted to proceed. Jacob told her. He was precise, and he was brief, and he did not repeat himself. Back in the lobby, the normal sounds of the bank had resumed: the chime, the keyboard clicks, the low hum of transaction noise. But the mood in the room was different. The people who had been there for both mornings, who had watched the man in the faded jacket get laughed at, and walked out and come back and been called Mr. Walker by a lawyer in a charcoal suit, were processing something that did not have a clean name. It was not quite guilt, and it was not quite shock. It was the specific discomfort of realizing that you had watched something happen and had decided it was not your problem and that it had turned out to be everyone's problem. Emily was at her window, technically still on shift, but she had not called the next number in 6 minutes. She sat very still and stared at her screen. Whatever was on that screen, she was not reading it. She was running and rerunning the last 2 days in her mind, and each time she got to the moment where she had laughed and said, "This is a bank, not a shelter," it arrived differently than it had felt when she said it. When she said it, it had felt like control. Now it felt like something she could not take back, which was because it was. Richard Coleman was in his office with the door closed. The 2 members of the legal team were in the hallway outside speaking in low voices. Sandra Lyle had asked Richard to remain available. He was available. He was sitting in his office chair with his jacket still buttoned, looking at a wall he had looked at every day for 2 years, wondering how a man in a beaten-up olive jacket had walked into his branch and changed everything in under 48 hours. The answer, of course, was that the man in the jacket had not changed anything. He had simply shown up. The things he had found were already there. They had been there for a long time. They had been there every day that Richard had walked past his own branch's complaint log without reading it carefully every day, that Emily had made a judgment call in under 2 seconds and moved on. Every day that the customers who did not look the right way had been made to feel that their time and their money and their presence in this building were less important than someone else's. Jacob Walker had not come in and broken something. He had come in and found something that was already broken, and he had looked at it long enough to understand what it was. That was the part that neither Richard nor Emily had expected, not the reveal, not the lawyers, not the title. They had not expected him to come back at all. They had assumed he would do what most people do when they are dismissed and mocked in a public space, absorb it and leave, and not return. He had returned. And now the conference room door was closed, and the footage was being pulled, and the complaint logs were being sent to legal, and the branch that had run for 2 years, on the unspoken assumption that appearance determined worth, was about to be examined from the inside out by the man whose name was on the building. The footage confirmed everything. Gerald Tate's team spent the better part of that afternoon reviewing security recordings from the previous 24 months. What they found was not shocking in the way that a single dramatic incident is shocking. It was shocking in the way that a pattern is shocking, the slow accumulation of small decisions, each one defensible in isolation, that together form something that cannot be defended at all. Customers in work clothes being redirected to longer lines, while others were waved through. Elderly clients being spoken over, interrupted handed back documents without explanation. A man who had come in 3 times over the course of 6 weeks to resolve an error on his account, each time being told to come back, each time leaving without resolution, until his complaint simply stopped appearing in the log because no one had logged it in the first place. The complaint records were worse than the footage. Gerald laid them out on the conference table in chronological order and walked Sandra through them one by one. 37 formal complaints over 24 months. Of those, 22 had been marked as resolved at the branch level with no documentation of how they had been resolved or whether the customer had been contacted. 9 had been logged and then closed without any follow-up notation. 6 had never been entered into the system at all. They existed only as handwritten notes in a folder that had been sitting in a filing cabinet in Richard Coleman's office, underneath a stack of quarterly performance reports. Sandra read through the folder without speaking. When she finished, she closed it and set it flat on the table and looked at Jacob. He was sitting across from her with his hands resting on the table, and he was not looking at the folder. He had already looked at what he needed to look at. He was looking at the wall at the framed panel mounted beside the door, the one that appeared in every Walker Financial branch, the one that read, "Every client who walks through our door deserves to be treated as our most important client." This branch had one too. It had been there the whole time. "How long has Coleman been managing this location?" Jacob asked. Sandra said 2 years and 4 months. Jacob nodded once. He already knew the number. He had looked it up the night before. He asked how many formal performance reviews Richard had received in that period. Sandra said 2, both satisfactory. Jacob asked who had conducted them. Sandra said the regional oversight team operating on a standard rotation schedule. Jacob asked whether anyone from regional oversight had spent time on the floor during operating hours in the last year, observing customer interactions directly. Sandra did not answer immediately, which was itself an answer. Jacob did not press the point. He understood what had happened. The branch had performed adequately on the metrics that were being measured: transaction volume, processing times, account retention, and so no one had looked closely at the things that were not being measured. The way a customer was spoken to did not appear on a quarterly performance report. The tone of voice a teller used when someone came in wearing paint-stained clothes did not generate a flag in the system. The complaint folder in the filing cabinet did not exist in any database that regional oversight would have reviewed. The branch had been by every official measure fine, and by every measure that actually mattered to the people walking through its doors, it had been failing for 2 years. By the end of that afternoon, the decisions had been made. Richard Coleman and Emily Carter were placed on immediate suspension, pending a formal investigation, with termination to follow upon completion of the review process. Marcus, the security guard, who had escorted Jacob from the premises without questioning the order he had been given, was reassigned to a non-customer-facing role, pending a separate review of the incident. The legal team began the process of contacting the customers whose complaints had been suppressed or mishandled, starting with the 6 whose issues had never been entered into the system at all. Sandra Lyle took personal responsibility for overseeing the branch operations through the transition period, which meant she would be at the Caldwell location every morning for the foreseeable future. 2 members of the regional oversight team were also reassigned, pending a review of how the branch's performance evaluations had been conducted. Jacob signed what he needed to sign that afternoon, answered the questions he needed to answer, and drove home before 6. He did not hold a press conference. He did not issue a statement. The internal communications that went out to branch staff and regional management that evening were factual and brief: a change in branch leadership, an internal review underway, a commitment to full cooperation with the process. His name appeared in those communications once in the sign-off line, the way it appeared on every official document that came out of Walker Holdings. Nothing more. The weeks that followed were not clean or simple. They rarely are when something that has been normalized for a long time is suddenly examined directly. Several tellers who had worked at the Caldwell branch for more than a year were interviewed by the legal team. Most of them said that what had happened with Jacob had surprised them, but when pressed, most of them also acknowledged that the culture of the branch, the way certain customers were categorized the moment they walked in, the way complaints were handled, the unspoken understanding of which clients received full attention and which received the minimum, had not surprised them at all. It was simply how things had been done. No one had told them explicitly to behave that way. No one had needed to. The behavior had been modeled from the top and then absorbed into the ordinary texture of daily operations until it became invisible. That was the part Jacob kept returning to in the weeks after the investigation closed. Not the individuals, the invisibility, the way a culture learns to hide itself inside routine until the people living inside it can no longer see it clearly enough to question it. He had built an organization on a principle he believed in genuinely, and somewhere in the architecture of that organization, the principle had been separated from the practice, and no one had noticed, including him. He commissioned a full operational review of all Walker financial branches, not just Caldwell. The review took 11 weeks and involved direct observation periods at every location, supplementary customer surveys, and a complete audit of complaint logs going back 5 years. What it found was that Caldwell was not an outlier. It was a more visible and extreme version of tendencies that existed to varying degrees across multiple locations. The findings were uncomfortable and expensive and necessary. Jacob used them to build something he called the Service Standards Initiative, which was a name he had not chosen. Himself, Gerald's communications team had suggested it, and which he found slightly too formal for what it actually was, which was a company-wide effort to close the distance between the thing he had written in the employee handbook and the thing that was actually happening on the floors of his branches every day. New training protocols, a revised complaint management system that required every customer escalation to be logged digitally and reviewed at the regional level within 72 hours. A dedicated feedback line that went directly to a small team reporting to Sandra, not to branch management. Performance evaluations restructured to include direct observation periods and anonymized customer feedback as weighted components. Not a perfect system, but a more honest one. The formal letters went out to affected customers 8 weeks after the investigation concluded. They were written in plain language without legal hedging, and they said directly that the customer had been treated in a manner inconsistent with the standards Walker Financial held itself to, that the branch's handling of their concerns had been inadequate, and that the organization was sorry. Not, "We regret any inconvenience," not, "We apologize for any miscommunication." Sorry. Jacob had written the first draft himself and given it to Gerald to review, and Gerald had suggested 2 minor edits for legal clarity and otherwise left it alone. Most of the responses that came back were quiet acknowledgments. A few were detailed and emotional people describing experiences they had carried for months without any expectation that someone would ever address them. One woman who had been a Walker Financial customer for over 16 years wrote back to say that she had closed her account after an incident at the Caldwell branch the previous spring and had not told anyone why. She said that she had assumed nothing would change. She said that receiving the letter had meant more to her than the organization probably understood. Jacob read that letter twice and then set it aside in a folder he kept separate from the others. 4 months after the morning he had been walked out of his own bank by a security guard, Jacob drove back to the Caldwell branch on a Tuesday. He parked in the same spot he had parked in on the first morning. He was wearing the olive jacket, not as a statement, not to test anything. It was simply the jacket he had reached for the same way he always did. He walked in at 8:53. A young woman at the welcome desk he had not seen before looked up when he came through the door and smiled. Not the performed smile of someone running through a script, but the ordinary, unremarkable smile of a person who had decided that the man walking in deserved a greeting. "Good morning," she said. "Can I help you with anything? Or are you here to see someone?" Jacob told her he had a standard transaction he needed to complete at one of the windows. She told him the wait was about 8 minutes and pointed him toward the number dispenser. He thanked her, took a number, and sat down along the wall. He watched the room the way he always did, not looking for problems this time, just watching. A man in a postal uniform came in and went directly to the far window, where a teller greeted him without looking him up and down first. An older man, who needed to sit down while he found his documents, was given the time he needed, without anyone in line sighing behind him. A woman at one of the center windows was explaining something in careful, patient terms to a customer who kept asking her to repeat herself, and the woman did repeat herself each time with the same tone, without the thin layer of irritation that had been so audible in this room 4 months ago. It was not a transformation into something extraordinary. It was something less dramatic and more durable than that, a room of people doing their jobs the way the job was supposed to be done, with the ordinary decency that most people are capable of, when the environment around them makes it the expected thing rather than the exceptional thing. When Jacob's number came up, he walked to the window. The teller was a man he had not seen before, mid-30s, calm and organized, in the way of someone who had been doing the work long enough to do it without tension. He took Jacob's documentation, reviewed it, carefully asked one clarifying question in a way that was professional and direct, and completed the transaction in under 4 minutes. He thanked Jacob, handed him his receipt, and called the next number. Jacob folded the receipt and put it in his jacket pocket. He stood for a moment at the window after the teller had turned back to his screen, not because he had anything left to say, but because he wanted to hold the moment for a few seconds before he let it pass. The lobby moved around him at its ordinary pace. The overhead display changed. The chime sounded. Someone near the entrance laughed at something their companion had said, and it was the uncomplicated laugh of a person who was somewhere they felt comfortable. Jacob walked to the exit. The security position near the door was now held by a young man named Travis, who had not been there 4 months ago, and who held the door open when he saw Jacob approaching, and said, "Have a good day, sir," with the easy, unaffected courtesy of someone who had not yet learned to calculate whether the gesture was worth making. He simply made it the way the job asked him to, because in this branch, now that was what the job looked like. Jacob stepped out onto the sidewalk on Caldwell Avenue and stood in the morning air for a moment, not thinking about the company, or the investigation, or the letters that had been sent out, or the review that was still ongoing at 6 other branches. He was thinking about the sentence he had written 15 years ago and put on the wall of every branch he had ever opened. Every client who walks through our door deserves to be treated as our most important client. He had written it because he believed it. He had spent the last 4 months trying to build an organization that actually lived inside it. He understood now in a way he had not fully understood when he wrote it, that the sentence was not a destination. It was a direction. Something you moved toward every day in every ordinary interaction with every person who walked through the door in whatever they happened to be wearing. You did not arrive at it and stop. You chose it again and again, in every small moment that no one was watching, and no one was measuring, and no one would ever audit. That was the only way it worked. That was the only way any of it worked. He put his hands in the pockets of the old olive jacket and walked back to his car.